For the first time in years, the American response is not just another diplomatic statement or a political deadline. U.S. nuclear submarines are now on the move, heading closer to Russia, and the message is clear. Nuclear deterrence is no longer a shadow game. But what does it really mean when America's most powerful weapons are openly deployed, and why could this change everything we thought we knew about global security? Let's find out. Today, we are going beyond the headlines. We will break down what triggered this dramatic shift, what it means when the United States sends its most secretive assets into full view, and how Russia and China are responding right now. We will look at the real risks behind the latest incidents at sea and why, for the first time in decades, American nuclear power is becoming visible to the whole world. And if you stay with me, you'll hear the one concrete signal that no major media outlet is talking about, but that could become the real turning point in the weeks ahead. The last few weeks have been a spiral of escalation, starting with public threats and countdowns between Washington and Moscow. After Donald Trump cut the deadline for a ceasefire in Ukraine to just 10 or 12 days, former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev publicly warned that the dead hand system, Russia's infamous automatic nuclear launch protocol, was now on the table as a deterrent. It was the kind of statement designed to send shockwaves through the diplomatic world. But this time, the White House decided not to stick with just words. As Reuters and Defense One both report, the order came down. 2 U.S. nuclear submarines were to be redeployed to positions closer to Russian waters, making a previously invisible threat suddenly impossible to ignore. To understand why this is a turning point, you have to know how nuclear deterrence works. Submarines form one arm of the nuclear triad, along with land-based missiles and strategic bombers, and are considered the ultimate insurance policy, since they can launch a retaliatory strike from anywhere in the world undetected. For decades, this capability was kept secret, a silent deterrent meant to prevent any first strike through sheer uncertainty. What's changed is that now, for the first time in years, the U.S. is putting this power in the spotlight. So what does it really mean for both Americans and Russians when 2 U.S. nuclear submarines are openly positioned near Russia? This move is much more than a demonstration of military might or a simple act of intimidation. It represents a calculated signal sent directly to Moscow and to the entire world that Washington is no longer content to respond only with words or carefully managed press releases. For decades, the backbone of U.S. nuclear deterrence has been the submarine fleet, often described by military experts as the most survivable, unpredictable, and dangerous component of the American arsenal. These submarines can operate undetected for months at a time, carrying ballistic missiles with enough destructive power to end any conflict before it truly begins. By tradition and by design, their movements are kept secret, precisely to maintain uncertainty in the mind of any potential adversary. The fact that the U.S. now chooses to surface or publicize the movement of these submarines is a radical change in doctrine. According to Reuters and the BBC, this decision was triggered by a combination of escalating Russian threats, the public invocation of the so-called dead hand system by former President Medvedev, and growing anxiety within NATO about the stability of its eastern borders. Instead of maintaining total secrecy, Washington has chosen to make its power visible, and in doing so, it is sending a message that escalation or threats from Moscow will not be answered in silence. But the significance goes even deeper. When a nuclear submarine surfaces or reveals its presence, it is not just about scaring the other side. It is a form of strategic communication intended to signal that the U.S. is actively managing the risk of escalation and is willing to demonstrate its readiness in the open. Military analysts from Foreign Affairs and GlobalSecurity.org explain that this shift from invisible deterrence to visible demonstrative deterrence forces both sides to rethink their calculations. When both adversaries know exactly where some of the most powerful weapons on the planet are located, it can create a moment of heightened caution because the stakes become more immediate and tangible. At the same time, this transparency can also make the situation more volatile. As the world saw during the Cold War, when the movement of nuclear forces becomes public knowledge, the risk of misunderstanding, miscalculation, or accidental escalation increases sharply. Every ship, plane, or unit that is suddenly put on alert or moved into a contested zone adds a new layer of complexity to the balance of power. And today, with so many players, including not only the US and Russia, but also NATO allies, regional powers, and even non-state actors, the dynamic is more unpredictable than ever. For ordinary Americans, this is not just an abstract chess game played by generals and diplomats. When nuclear submarines become part of the daily news, it means that the era of silent deterrence is over. The reality is that nuclear power is no longer just a memory from history books or documentaries about the Cold War. It is an active, immediate part of global events. The knowledge that these submarines are now openly deployed brings the risk, but also the responsibility, closer to home for everyone. It means living in a world where decisions made in Washington or Moscow, or even by commanders at sea, can have real and immediate consequences for millions of people. And while the hope is that this visible display of deterrence will help prevent war by making the costs clear to all sides, it also means that every new movement, every public announcement, and every response must be analyzed and understood carefully, because the margin for error is smaller than ever. This is why so many experts are watching these developments closely, and why it matters now, more than at any point in the last generation, to pay attention not just to what is said, but to what is actually done. Russia's official response to the American move was a complex mix of provocation and restraint, sending conflicting messages to both its own population and the international community. Kremlin spokesman, as reported by Time and the BBC, insisted that Medvedev's public mention of the dead hand system, the automatic protocol for launching a retaliatory nuclear strike if Russian command is incapacitated, was meant to be purely defensive, a reminder that Russia possesses a second strike capability designed to deter reckless action, not to invite it. Yet, at the very same time, Russian military officials quietly raised the alert status of strategic nuclear forces, putting them on a higher state of readiness and ordering visible exercises involving mobile missile units and bomber aircraft. Russian state media wasted no time amplifying the narrative that the United States was crossing a red line by making its deterrent posture so public, portraying Washington's submarine movement as a deliberate attempt to force escalation and paint Russia into a corner. The effect is to keep the Russian public on edge, while signaling to foreign governments that the stakes have risen, and that Russia will not back down if provoked further. But the story does not end at the European front. In parallel, China has been making moves of its own. According to coverage from Newsweek and the South China Morning Post, the Chinese military has intensified its activities in the Western Pacific, launching new naval drills and flying aggressive air patrols around the increasingly sensitive areas of Taiwan and the South China Sea. In just the last few days, a U.S. Navy reconnaissance helicopter and a Chinese Navy frigate came dangerously close to one another in disputed waters, with each side accusing the other of unsafe maneuvers. While incidents like this are not entirely new, the context is now far more dangerous than before. With both Russia and China operating at a higher level of tension and suspicion, the risk of accidental confrontation, whether it happens in the sky over the Black Sea, in the narrow straits near Taiwan, or on the ground in a cyber operation, has become a persistent fear among military planners and analysts. Experts caution that it is precisely in these moments, when nerves are stretched and communication is poor, that the danger of miscalculation or unintended escalation is at its peak. A single misinterpreted radar signal, a malfunctioning warning system, or even a show of force meant for domestic audiences can trigger a response that neither side originally wanted. During the Cold War, there were documented cases where false alarms nearly led to disaster simply because officials on one side believed the other was about to launch an attack. Today, with more actors involved in faster decision cycles, the margin for error has shrunk even further. What may look to the public like a distant chess match is, in reality, a web of constant high-stakes signaling, with every maneuver scrutinized for possible signs of intent. For Americans, and for anyone watching global events, this means that the danger is not just a direct missile exchange or an official declaration of war. The real risk is that an isolated incident, like a close encounter at sea, a cyber attack that goes too far, or a military exercise that is misread, could spiral into a broader conflict before anyone has a chance to pull back. That is why analysts interviewed by Defense One, Foreign Affairs, and Nikkei Asia are paying such close attention to these encounters, warning that with so many moving parts and so much distrust, the likelihood of an accidental crisis is now higher than it has been in decades. In this environment, even a small mistake could change the entire balance of power in a matter of hours. So what does all this mean for the average American watching these developments unfold? For most of the past 30 years, the threat of nuclear conflict felt distant, something reserved for the history books or dramatized in movies, an abstract shield in the background of daily life. Deterrence was a silent force operating in secrecy and rarely discussed outside the worlds of defense and diplomacy. But now, suddenly, that silence has been broken. When you see news stories about U.S. nuclear submarines moving closer to Russia, or hear government officials openly discussing the risks and responsibilities of deterrence, it is a signal that the era of invisible security is over. This is not just about having bigger weapons or proving a point to Moscow or Beijing. It is about the fact that the old rules of the game, the ones that kept crises contained and dangers out of sight, are starting to change. What does this mean in practical terms? First, it means that every American, whether living near a major city, a military base, or a rural town, needs to be aware that the global security environment is more dynamic and more fragile than at any time since the end of the Cold War. Analysts for Defense One and FEMA stress that the most important thing for the public is not to panic, but to pay attention to certain signals that can offer early warning of real change. Three things matter most. The first is sudden changes in military alert status. If you notice news about the U.S. military moving to higher readiness, deploying additional forces, or issuing public statements about increased vigilance, that is a sign that something behind the scenes has shifted. These moves are often subtle and reported in technical language, but they are some of the earliest indicators that leaders see new risks on the horizon. Second, Americans should be alert to new patterns of cyber activity, especially cyber attacks targeting infrastructure like power grids, water supplies, transportation, or communications networks. Modern conflict is not just about missiles and tanks, but also about who can disrupt the systems that keep a country running. FEMA and the Department of Homeland Security have repeatedly warned that even a minor disruption to critical infrastructure can have cascading effects, affecting millions of people before anyone realizes what is happening. If you see multiple reports of cyber incidents in a short period, or if official agencies begin to talk about increased threat levels in the digital domain, it is worth paying close attention. Third, keep an eye out for official messages about civil defense readiness. In the past, this might have meant public service announcements or test alerts on television and radio. Today, it can include everything from updates on emergency preparedness websites to alerts sent directly to your phone. If state or federal agencies begin to communicate more often about evacuation routes, shelter locations, or emergency supply kits, that is a clear sign that they are taking the risk of crisis seriously, and you should too. But perhaps the biggest change is psychological. When deterrence moves from invisible to visible, from silent to openly discussed, it changes how people feel about their own safety. For some, it may bring reassurance, knowing that the government is taking action and making threats clear to potential adversaries. For others, it may cause anxiety, a sense that the world is closer to the edge than at any time in recent memory. The truth is, both reactions are understandable. The key is not to fall into panic or denial, but to develop a habit of staying informed, asking questions, and preparing in practical ways for unexpected events. Remember, in the new normal, signals can matter as much as actions. The next escalation may not come with dramatic headlines or viral images, but with a subtle shift in posture, a change in the way leaders talk about risk, or a quiet mobilization of forces that only a few people notice at first. That is why your perspective is so important and why I want to hear from you in the comments. Are you feeling safer, more vulnerable, or simply more alert now that America's most powerful weapons are out in the open? Your insights could help others process and prepare for these changes, building a community that understands not just what is happening, but what it really means. In moments like this, it is easy to fall into panic or numbness. But understanding the real signals behind the headlines is the key to staying ahead of the curve. The visible movement of nuclear submarines could be a way to restore stability, or it could signal a world where deterrence is more fragile than ever. The best thing you can do is stay informed, share your thoughts, and keep watching for the subtle signs that matter most. If you have made it this far, you are not just a headline reader. Subscribe now so you don't miss the real story as it unfolds, and tell me in the comments, do you see this as a step toward peace or a warning that things are only getting more dangerous? Stay sharp, Safety Zone community.